I think if you could make a straightforward case to the public, they would say, all right, I'll pay a nickel more for bananas. Don't run me over.
We're going to be talking about truck driver compensation and how it correlates with road safety. And so talk about the research that you've done. So again, before we get started, just state your name, your title, and what it is that you do.
Okay, I'm Mike Belzer. I'm professor of economics at Wayne State University in Detroit, and I study the trucking industry, and in particular, trucking labor economics, industrial relations, all of that kind of thing. And in particular, very specifically, I've been studying this issue of compensation in its broad sense and narrow sense, and safety and health for more than 25 years. So it's been a while. And you'd think by now people would catch on and say, well, let's just pay these people and have this problem go away. But you know how it is.
Right, and we'll talk about that here in a little bit too. But yeah, as you mentioned, I was looking at back at your history of the papers that you've had published, and you've been talking about driver compensation and how it correlates to safety for quite a while. And I just noticed that you had a report that was recently published in the journal that talks about again truck driver compensation and how it applies to the safety of the roadways. Can you kind of explain what your latest research found and how you came to that conclusion?
Well, it's like you've pointed out, just the latest. There are more coming after that.
Nice.
So I have PhD students who keep following down this, and we're going to do more of them. So I started out doing this kind of research very specifically back in, I think it was 97. So that gives you some idea of specifically how long I've been at it. And this latest piece is it's a little bit complicated, but it's simple and straightforward ultimately. So we took intrastate carriers, and we did that for a reason, because intrastate carriers we know aren't driving out of state. So for that reason, we could take those carriers and look using a special data set. We can determine what the pay is within the state for truck drivers.
Okay.
And so we use those data, and we use the Motor Carrier Management Information System data that Federal Motor Carrier Safety Administration maintains, and just looked at those intrastate carriers. All this elaborate activity on our part is not because we don't care about interstate carriers. It's because when you do this kind of research, you have to compare apples to apples. And so everything has to stay in a narrow range in order to hold your conditions constant. So by looking at those intrastate carriers and controlling for state characteristics the best we could determine that overall, for every 1% in driver pay, and literally we're talking here just about their what is supposed to be hourly pay, but that's another complicated question to address. But that's the pay that's reported by the Bureau of Labor Statistics and the Census Department. But for every 1% in driver pay, there's a 3% lower crash rate for the firm. So it's a very strong relationship. And we were, in the peer review process, criticized that maybe we were biasing it incorrectly because we included all carriers. As everybody really knows, most trucking companies are very small. Most intrastate carriers are very small, like 5 trucks. And what we cut out all the big carriers that were bigger than 8 trucks, because there are a few larger carriers that just operate intrastate. So we took those out to see if that was creating an effect. It did create an effect, but it gives us the most conservative uh, 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 the most conservative answer that we could get, which is there's essentially a one-to-one relationship between driver pay rate and the safety of the firm. So for every 10%, at the mean, for every 10% in higher driver compensation, you're going to have a 10% reduction in crashes. So that's a long-winded summary, but it gives you an idea of how complicated it is to do the work, but we keep getting the same results, as you can tell by looking at the record year in and year out with more data sets and so forth.
I kind of answered the question that I had for you, and just to make sure to go back to it and make sure that I understand that correctly. So, yeah, 2 years ago, you released a similar paper that showed a 3-to-1 relationship, and the latest one is more of like a 1-to-1. And so, the big difference then between those is that you took out the larger carriers. Is that correct?
That's right. I mean,
Okay,
you would look at that and sort of say that implies that the bigger carriers are less safe, right?
that's
But
kind
we
of where I'm
can't.
going with that. Sure.
That's where you're going. I can see that, and I felt the same way. But we can't exactly say that.
Sure.
But my hunch would lean in that direction. And for whatever reason, I think as the owner operators know, you are driving the truck yourself or whatever. You don't have a lot of leeway for playing games. So you know the person who's driving it, you know the conditions you're under, you know the pressures. There's no third party out there pushing you to do stuff you shouldn't do. And that's what I've learned from decades of talking with owner operators about this, is that they are they may tend to be safer. They believe they are safer. They may tend to be safer because they're driving and because it's their life. So I think that's a reasonable explanation. We just can't prove that the bigger carriers are less safe.
Sure.
You make your own judgments.
Uh, as you pointed out, the study looks at intrastate trucking companies. Uh, is there any data that you've done in the past, or maybe is it possible to extrapolate the results of the intrastate truckers and kind of take that to apply it to interstate truckers? Or would that be too much of a reach with the
It's
study?
always hard to do, as I said, because we're always trying to compare apples and apples. However, if you were to look through, which could cause you to hair to fall out, but if you were to go through the long list of publications that we have lots of publications either at the individual carrier level, at a small number of carriers in a case study. We have longitudinal ones over a period of time. All of them, whether they're intrastate or intrastate, point the same direction. You get what you pay for.
Sure.
And it shouldn't be a big surprise to anybody with the simplest understanding of economics that you get what you pay for. So if you want to go cheap, you're going to get what you pay for. If you want to pay for the cost of doing the work, you'll get what you pay for.
Now, again, so the paper talks about truck driver wages, and you use the hourly wage because that's the data that you have available to you. Do you think there's any is there any comparable research that's been done that kind of looks at the pay by mile wage structure instead? And do you think that it would probably apply the same way?
Absolutely does. So again, if you want to go to my website, michaelbelzer-saferates.com, you will find research, most of the research, anything that I can make available, getting around whatever copyright limitations there may be. Going back 25 years, you will find a lot of research showing that, in fact, the mileage rate matters. So the mileage rate has about the same kind of relationship, at least a 1-to-1, maybe stronger. Uh, we did a study of J.B. Hunt 20 more than 25 years ago now, and that J.B. Hunt study showed quite conclusively that, in fact, for every 10% in driver pay at the mean, driver pay rate, we're talking mileage rate here,
Mhm.
you have a 30% reduction in the probability of crash. So it's a 3-to-1 relationship. So it's the same relationship that we showed using all the carriers. And it was a very powerful relationship. And this was the study that kind of got it all kicked off. That started in 97 with the, for anybody who's old enough, the Office of Motor Carriers was what the organization, the government agency was before Federal Motor Carrier Safety Administration was created. They contracted with me to do this. And we had a very strong relationship on mileage pay. I will also say we have a recent set of papers that former student of mine and I did published just in the last few years. There are links to that. I think, on the website. I can double check to see if those things are actually available to download, but people contact me and I can get it if it's not. But that shows that drivers, the lack of pay, we know that the median truck driver, more than half of all truck drivers don't get paid anything for non-driving work time. So that's the famous, if these wheels ain't turning, I'm not making any money argument. And we confirmed that. And to the extent that they are working with no pay, they have a much stronger risk of safety and health risk because it drives your blood pressure up,
Oh,
which
sure.
should be no surprise to anybody who does this for a living. As
Right.
your listeners may know, I used to do this for a living, so I had hints that came from my experience. And I can tell you, before 1980, I was always paid for my time, miles an hour, as it was called. And after deregulation, the pressure was very severe on trucking companies. All these small companies came in, and they were used to not paying for driver time. They didn't have to. And so they use up and waste that driver time in big globs. And that time has a safety cost. So whether it's pay by the mile, pay for your non-driving labor, or any other mechanism, the rate of pay, all of it shows the same thing in different ways, which is you get what you pay for.
Now, with all this research that's out there, and there's a lot of it, that basically confirms that the driver pay in association with safety, why is it that you think, particularly the larger firms, why they are not paying their drivers more, given that you could possibly drive down, insurance premiums, for example, given the safety correlation here?
Well, we could get into a conversation that might get off topic and with which OIDA might have a problem, but bottom line here is that for a long time, this relationship has been established and shown. I think that the biggest opponent to raising the pay is not really the trucking companies, although some of them are supportive of paying more money and some of them are not. But the shippers don't want to pay more money. Now, that will shock you, I know.
Right.
So, but the people that are paying for the cost of the freight don't want to pay it. I think if you could make a straightforward case to the public, they would say, all right, I'll pay a nickel more for bananas. Don't run me over. And that, in fact, that's the case that I make over and over here and in other countries in the world. Starting a big project right now in Australia, looking at exactly the same thing. I've done this elsewhere in the world, and it's consistent. It's just that every single time I have to prove it. And the other thing is the big opposition is really coming from the shippers that like to get the cheap freight. And you get what you pay for.
Right.
So
Right.
JB Hunt, when they raised their pay back in 97, as I recall, so it was a big deal. And they took a lot of heat from Schneider, and they took a lot of heat from a lot of other trucking companies. But when they raised their pay by, as it turned out, 38%, just like that, just in a heartbeat, they made an announcement in September of 96, and they implemented it in February of 97. And I got the data from before and after and was able to and you can download this, by the way, on my website. It's available. That paper, that research showed that with that 38% rate of pay increase that they paid, they got a 50% reduction in turnover and a 50% reduction in crashes and a 3/4 reduction in big crashes, which we had the actuarial information so we could give it a dollar value. No matter how you do it, pay matters. And we were able to show in a paper that we published, a colleague and I published in 2018, that the reason why truck drivers work such long hours is they do it to get paid, which is a big shock, I'm sure, to you. But that's what we do, is prove the obvious, right?
Right.
And so we're able to show that as the pay rate crosses the, it's called it's a backward bending labor supply curve. As the pay rate gets higher, drivers don't choose to work more hours at the margin. They choose to turn down loads. I made enough to make my bills. I don't need this. It's killing me. And so they turn back their amount of work that they do. And that's a good thing, not a bad thing. That's the right thing, because their ability to stay at the 60-hour-a-week limit you're supposed to be working was enhanced by getting paid. So again, why do truck drivers work such long hours? They do it for the money, like everybody else does.
So with that being said, then would it then make sense? So there's a lot of talk about currently, and there has been discussions about this for a while, about detention time pay, for example. So, the times waiting for a load. So just based on everything that would it then just make sense that if truckers started to get paid for more detention time, perhaps that would increase roadway safety overall?
Right. In fact, the Office of the Inspector General, whom I consulted, or who consulted me, I didn't consult them, who on that question when they did that big study published just before COVID. But that showed a very strong prevalence to the extent that there's unpaid detention time. There's a much higher crash rate at the company, and they defined, I believe, incorrectly. That's another, but that's all they had in data. Back to the same, they have the same problem that we've got, maybe worse. But anyway, they looked at detention time and they marked out, they called detention the 2 hours. You know about the 2 hours.
Right.
I was a truck driver in the 1970s and into the 1980s. That 2 hour limit was a grace period that the Interstate Commerce Commission rate had to define. You had to define that grace period for all the companies. And so everything was above board. It was right there in the rate. And your rate had to reflect the fact that there would be at least 2 hours. There would be these 2 hours of free time. And the driver was to be paid for all that. And in the days that I was a truck driver, I was a teamster, I was always paid for that time. I could see the change happening immediately after deregulation in 1980. And that is, suddenly companies were demanding that the drivers give away this time for free. Even teamster companies, it's the same thing. So once they did that, they started this downward march. And it's pretty clear to me that for every bit of time that a driver's wheels aren't turning, he ought to be paid. And if he's paid, then somebody's going to be paying him. That somebody is the trucking company to the first approximation, and the shipper to the second and the most important. So if the shipper has to pay for the driver's time, that shipper is not going to waste that time. That shipper is going to treat that driver with respect. Everybody knows the story of sitting at a dock and watching that union driver or that UPS driver get in and get out immediately while your guy is sitting out there by the fence waiting to get unloaded or loaded, whichever it might be. And that's because they have to pay those people for their time. Everybody ought to get paid for their work time, and it's pretty simple. And I believe that the public completely agrees with that. If you can put it to them very clearly, they will agree to it, and they will say, if I got to pay another nickel for bananas, I'll pay another nickel for bananas. Pay these people for their work. And that's really as simple as you can make it.
Oh yeah, for sure. And so it would, I think one can reason then, again, based on the research that you've done, that during a freight recession, kind of like we're in right now, freight rates are, spot rates are down, truckers are getting paid less. I would imagine then during freight recessions like we're in now, crashes involving large trucks would increase as well. Is that something that we're pretty much seeing as far as you know?
Well, we have been seeing an increase since the crash of '08. And I just gave a presentation at the University of Utah last Friday on this very question. And one of my first slides is FMCSA's Figure 1 in their latest version of, of facts, the fact book, I think it is. And you can see ever since '08, that rate has been marching up, and we're now at a historically high rate. So it jigs and zags, but it's been marching up pretty relentlessly. And I think it's because ever since the financial crisis, the pressure has been on everybody throughout the recovery. And then we got the recovery finally done after 10 years, and then COVID. So the pressure has been on all the time. And so the drivers are still not getting paid. In spite of all the hype that I hear, the truck drivers are still not getting paid for their non-driving time. There's actually a bill before Congress. Now, nothing gets done in Congress nowadays without a lot of arm twisting or I mean, this is the
Sure.
most nothing Congress in history, I guess. It's right there, the very bottom. But it's in logjam, so that's why it's really happening. But there's a bill before Congress on the House side and on the Senate side to remove a very important single sentence in the Fair Labor Standards Act that was passed in the mid 1930s that says any truck drivers engaged in interstate commerce do not the 40-hour work week doesn't apply to them. In other words, we don't have to worry about their time, and specifically, we don't have to worry about overtime. So this particular rule says take the provision that excludes truck driver overtime out of the federal law so that all drivers are paid for all their time, period. Once you do that, it took me a while to warm to the idea that such a simple change would do such a job.
All right.
But President Biden supports this. We have the House and the Senate. It's sitting there. I believe OOIDA also supports this change. So the OOIDA and the Teamsters support this change, and the safety people support this change. And I tell you, my research confirms that this change would be really, really big. It would be big for the public, but also be big for the drivers.
Yeah, if I remember right, I believe that's the Got Truckers Act. If I remember the
Correct.
name right, yeah. And
Love
so
that.
yeah, right. It's a great name. That's the thing about legislation; they always have someone who's good with the acronyms and figuring out how to make it a catchy name.
Right,
Uh,
exactly.
but yeah, as you pointed out, yeah, Teamsters, OYDA, trucking safety groups, all for this. I'm imagining ATA probably not so much, since they kind of represents the larger firms, and so that cuts into their bottom line. But I think the bottom line for everyone here is that, again, there is a very strong correlation between what these truckers are getting paid, and
Right.
then just overall roadway safety. So is there anything that you are working on that we can look forward to in the future regarding
Oh, yeah.
this topic in general?
I have several papers now in process. I have a book chapter coming out in probably this summer on trucking. Uh, but I will say that one thing that your readers would be interested in that I think you can download from my website as well is a research paper that we did on the JB Hunt data. It's old data, yeah, I know, but it doesn't matter. It's the relationship among the various factors that really matters. So we were able to finally figure out that. So I told you about the JB Hunt research that was started back in 97, and that from that many papers have come, and other ideas for more papers have come. But one of the things that was important is, first of all, the pay explains the safety. That's the part we've been talking about.
Yeah.
We can explain safety. It's the biggest factor that predicts safety. All the other inspections and other kind of stuff that they do doesn't come close to having the effect that pay has in predicting safety. If you pay more, you will get results. But what was impressive when we finally were able to pull this out, it's imperfect research because we didn't have all the data we needed when the JB Hunt experiment started. How about if we pay these people? So we didn't have it all, but we had enough of it. And what we were able to show is that the higher paid experienced drivers that JB Hunt hired to replace the students that they were using before, those higher paid experienced drivers made the company more money, and a lot more money. According to our research, it paid JB Hunt $10,000 a year per driver per year more money to pay them more money. And that's because those experienced drivers, the entire time of that year that we had of data, the first year, the second year that I told you we compared, once we had the experienced drivers that they selected for that are being paid more than a third more money and more benefits, those drivers produce 1,000 miles per month more production than the inexperienced drivers would do. And that will be no surprise to your listeners as well, or your members, because they will say, well, of course. But like I said, economists, we gotta go through a lot of very fancy trouble to prove what you
Sure.
can say, of course. So that's why I say I started with the hunch that comes from my experience, and I drove a truck for 750,000 miles, roughly speaking. And then I learned how to do the research. I did the research, and I found the same thing that I thought was true. And this research has stood up over and over and over again. But the idea that the trucking companies that look for the cheap labor are saving money is simply not true. The drivers that they pay more for are making the companies more money than the drivers they pay less to. So there's a common misconception of how people think. We call this the zero-sum game, which is basically I win, you lose, right? If I have to pay more money, it means I have less trips to the golf course. But in fact, because the drivers are so much productive, the trucking company executives have more trips to the golf course, and
Sure.
their job is easier.
And I imagine that they would also be attracting more experienced drivers with higher pay, which in turn would also drop down, insurance premiums,
All that.
any type of claims, lost cargo, all that stuff that comes with experienced
All
drivers,
that stuff.
all that
We
stuff.
used everything we could get that wasn't as complete as we'd like. We always live with imperfect data. But my PhD student who worked on this thing used everything, the two of us pulled everything we could get together and incorporated all the data that we could, knowing that we're still missing a few pieces. One of the things, for example, was missing. It was very hard. If you've been around long enough, you will remember, some people in your audience will remember, that JB Hunt changed the strategy in the mid 1990s, and they started putting more boxes on intermodal. And they invested in a whole container fleet that would go onto the be 48 footers that would go as a truck and could go on the rail so that it can go far west without the truck driver expense, without that long 2,000 mile haul. So they spent a lot of money on that, and they did a number of other things at the same time. So that confuses things a little bit. But bottom line, once they decided to raise their pay to get to reduce the turnover and stop the crashes, if you have a lot of crashes, you can't be a reliable supply chain partner in auto industry because they need that truck to show up when it's supposed to. So once they paid more money, they were able to get greater performance, and they were able to do two things. One was, as you just said, get better people. The other one is they could retain those people. So this is recruitment and retention. The Biden administration's language throughout this administration so far has been, it's really not a driver shortage. There isn't any such thing as a driver shortage. There is a recruitment and retention problem. And that's because at the margin, people decide, is it worth it to get the CDL to work that hard if I'm not making any money? So a very rational decision on the part of the drivers is to quit and do something else. So we lose all those people.
Right.
So this thing has been upside down for decades, and it's time to turn the truck right side up with the dirty side down where it belongs.
Right. And, as far as, you talked about, with the federal government, they've tried to address safety, particularly with FMCSA, through different technology mandates. We've seen that with ELDs, rear underride guards. They're trying it with side underride guards now, but we have seen consistently that each time these technological mandates are put into place, there has been no change in crash rates. And in fact, since the ELDs came out, there has been an increase. Right. Yeah, exactly. So we have tried, and I mean, the federal government has tried to address safety at the truck level, these technological mandates. I guess the one thing that hasn't been tried yet, and we have the research to back it up, is to somehow increase these wages. That seems to be the thing that hasn't been tried yet, that maybe we should probably look into, which I understand is it's tricky from a government level because you're dealing with wages, and so they can't really tap into that too much, with the free market being what it's being.
You can do some things. So if you look on my website, you will find some presentations, other places. So what I've finally figured out, and I'm slow, I'll admit, I finally began to understand the extent to which the law that governs everybody but truck drivers is different from the law that governs truck drivers. That makes no sense because the labor market includes people who go back and forth between truck driving and doing other things. And if truck driving is not attractive, they will do other things. So the Fair Labor Standards Act says that you get paid for all your time. And it defines work as being essentially employed. Now, your owner-operators may be, to the extent that they're real independent owner-operators, no boss leaning over their shoulder, they set their own. But the labor market overall is set by all these employment relationships. So the fact that truck drivers live under a different set of rules than everybody else in the United States ought to be a wake-up call. And so what I've realized is that truck drivers are working these long hours because they're not paid. So everybody else, as the Got Truckers Act is all about, everybody else gets paid overtime after 40. I'll tell you, it's even more than that. In order to pay overtime after 40, you have to actually collect the information on work time. And as you know, they don't do that. Trucking companies don't do that. The only ones that do that would be Teamster companies or local companies that do punch in and punch out hourly pay. But for road drivers, which is probably the bulk of your audience, There's nobody collecting that information. And the definition of work is very different. The definition of work the Department of Labor uses is you are working if your employer has you working. Pretty simple.
Sure.
And for the Federal Motor Carrier Safety Administration, oh no, working is only when the company says you're working, not when the company actually employs you to work.
Right.
So if part of your work includes loading and unloading, or part of your work includes waiting to load and unload, waiting at the dock, doing all this kind of crazy stuff, waiting for a dispatch, that's work. That's not your free time. That's work. Department of Labor regulations say you get paid for all that time.
Right.
Department of Transportation, FMCSA regulations say you don't. We don't care if you get paid or not. That's what they say. But in fact, that undermines their whole safety mission because of the relationship between compensation and safety. So we have shown over and over, and we'll continue to do this. And just year in and year out, we're going to do it. And over and over, we're going to just pile this research on like a boring guy I am. Bam, 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 bam. Pay these people for their time, and your problem goes away. And there's no way that trucking can compete with the rest of the labor market if it doesn't pay the people to do the work.
Yeah, I think a
Oh,
better way to look at the Got Truckers Act is it's being kind of touted as a bill for wage fairness in wages and labor, but really it should be touted as a safety bill more than anything else. And I think some redirection that way could help a long ways on probably get that bill moving. But yeah,
right. That would be very strong. I know the Safety Coalition, Truck Safety Coalition, uh, pushes it, and they tout it as safety, but they still keep responding to these crazy regulations that FMCSA puts out. Sorry, I said that, FMCSA. But they put them out because they don't believe they have the authority to 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 specify pay. And this is why, with the support of OIDA, as a matter of fact, I testified before Congress in 2012 saying, break down this wall. Wasn't Mr. Gorbachev break down the wall? The same, break down this wall between the Department of Labor and Department of Transportation. You guys got to get your heads together, because if transportation can't say you got to pay people for their work, and labor can say, and labor department could say, oh, we can't tell them to pay people, there's a truck driver exemption, we break down the wall, and the Got Truckers Act probably is 90% of the deal right there to break down that wall. And then the Department of Labor could do more to regulate to make sure the truck drivers get paid for their time.
yeah,
By doing that, I think most of our problems go away. And frankly, when I was studying before FMCSA was created, they asked me for my judgment and did some research for them on what they called EOBR back then, electronic onboard recorders. Another term for the electronic logbook or whatever they want to call it. It's all the same thing. And I said, well, this is great if you want to measure their time driving. You at least know they're driving. But even then, I knew the problem was non-driving time, and you're not measuring any of that. And so I see when as an expert witness, I look at logs, and I can see when they go into the sleeper berth for 15 minutes. Come on, it takes me 15 minutes to get into the sleeper berth. Don't give me this nonsense. They literally just they go from driving to sleeper berth. No, 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 no. And this is all based on self-report. So there's no way the electronic logbook would work. And in fact, the guy from uh, what do you call that again? The Inspector General came to
mhm,
talk to me. I was at a Transportation Research Board meeting. I fielded a question on a session that I had created with a global set of players in this business. And somebody said, well, won't the electronic logbook solve this problem? And this was in the late teens. And I said, no, it makes it worse.
Yeah.
And it makes it worse because it makes it so easy to cheat on your logs. Easier than it was before. In certain ways, it's easier than it was before. But the big thing is that all that on duty time is being logged off duty. I think that's the overwhelming factor. And look, every owner operator or every truck driver, road driver is under pressure to do that because they got to pay their bills.
Right.
Unless they're getting paid for their time, this isn't going to get fixed. I will say also something that your folks will probably recognize right away. Anybody who gets a product or a service for free will consume an infinite amount of that product or service because it's free. Well, if that free is the truck driver's labor time, they'll consume an infinite amount of it. There is no end to what they'll consume. That's why they bring you in for a 7 a.m. load and don't dispatch you finally until 3 in the afternoon because they don't care because they're not paying for that time.
Right. Right.
This is fixable. This is obviously fixable. There has to be the will to go fix it.